You can't really talk about video game censorship without talking about China, because China is pretty much the top dog of not just video game censorship, but censorship towards pretty much anything in general. I've talked about China a while back during the whole devotion hoopla, and I'm gonna retell you everything that I found in my previous videos before we get into what's actually happening as of late, because it involves China restricting minors from playing too much video games. And the thing is, there's a little bit of a way to cheat the system that not a lot of people that I've seen talk about. And before we get to all of that, I want to give huge thanks to the people who supported me on PayPal, Patreon, etc. You can do so by checking the links down below. Also, thanks to the weekly donators on my streams. You can check out my stream channel link down below and donate to me there when you'll get a live and direct shout out every Saturday 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I've talked about the video game Devotion and how the game got review bombed because it mocked the Chinese government. The publisher of the game got their business license revoked by the Chinese government, which means that they're not allowed to conduct any sorts of business in that area. So despite the fact that it was the developer who put the mockery in it, it was the publisher who got the hit, and that's why the game isn't on Steam and many other digital distribution websites. Even GOG stepped into the line for a brief moment and promised to sell Devotion, but apparently thanks to receiving many messages from gamers, they've decided not to sell it. Right, GOG, way to stand up for the gamers. So, can you actually buy the game? Well, yes, you can. The game developer decided to self-publish the game on their website, Red Candle Games, with no DRM as well. So, if you're interested in buying the game, you can go ahead and do that right there, alongside their other game, Detention. What's really cool is that the game itself was preserved in the Harvard Yenching Library, which is one of the largest East Asian libraries in the Western world, according to Harvard, with the collections dating back to 1979. It's not available online, but it is available on a single computer in a specific room. But what does Devotion have to do with anything? Well, Devotion is pretty much one of the biggest video game industry censorship news that have stormed the World Wide Web in the last decade, and it's one of the amazing examples that highlight how much power that China has towards the gaming industry. Devotion is just one of the worst case scenarios. There are actually some smaller forms of censorship happening towards other more popular titles in the market, especially multiplayer titles. China is well known on censoring a lot of things, such as the depiction of blood, skulls, skeletons, zombies, or death in general. Back in May 2019, PUBG Mobile's death animation was censored to the point where the character doesn't die anymore. They just put their items and wave goodbye, which is strangely wholesome. China was really anticipating the release of CSGO back in 2017, but the publisher Perfect World had to make some changes on, well, lots of things. You can check them out right there. But at least with CSGO, as long as you don't live in China, you can still enjoy the original untainted version. There are, however, some cases where China's influence is enough to cause censorship in all regions of the game. Ubisoft's Rainbow Six Siege, for example, was censored globally due to China's censorship demands. If it weren't for the players finding out about the censorship and complaining about the aesthetic changes, Ubisoft wouldn't have backed down on it. And yes, they absolutely did back down on those changes, and players speculate that the reason why they made the changes global is because they're way too lazy to implement it specifically for the Chinese market. There are many examples of stories like these where China has a lot of influence towards the gaming market to the point where they get to say what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in games, including in the global release. It's totally possible for game developers and publishers to make the changes that meet the Chinese demands globally. It can be thanks to government pressure, or it can be just utter laziness from their part. But it's not just gaming content that China is controlling, it's also the gaming behaviors of its players, particularly minors. Way back then, I've talked about China's attempts on regulations. China's state mouthpiece, called People's Daily Online Edition, published a set of draft for rules regulating gaming content for players of different age groups. The rules are proposed by the mouthpiece and more than 10 other major Chinese gaming giants, including Tencent, Perfect World, NetEase, etc., and it divides players into 4 age categories: under 16, 12, 16, and above 18. Why does this classification matter? Well, people who are under the age of 6 are recommended to not play video games on their own, so they have to be supervised. The games themselves are also censored so that it doesn't feature puppy love or inappropriate clothing in an environment that they're in, such as a bikini in a war zone. At that time, that regulation was on its proposal stage. As gaming gets more and more popular, it felt like that's getting more and more real. There are some that were already implemented at the time, such as child account locks that cause people to make adult accounts and sell them in the black market. What do you know? More restrictions result to more illegal activities. And that's where we get to the most recent news of China's overly controlling behavior. Earlier this month, as I already talked about in another video, Chinese media described video games as spiritual opium, and another article made by a bunch of concerned parents agree on it, especially during the pandemic and their children's reliance on technology in order to get their education in this time of the year. Right now, China has introduced even more limits on anyone under 18 on playing video games. You can only play for about 3 hours per week. That's right, 3 hours per week on games. Video game companies can only provide services to minors at Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and public holidays between 8 to 9 p.m. They're basically doing what my parents were doing to me back when I was a kid. But I guess Asian parenting isn't brutal enough, so the government had to step in to legally enforce it to everyone, not just to the gamers, but also to the game companies. The reason why they do this is so that this can guide minors to actively participate in physical exercise, social practice, and various colorful, healthy, and beneficial recreational activities. In other words, stop playing games and go outside, you loser. The restrictions are so stringent that they're even implementing facial recognitions. Yep, facial recognitions. The government is going that far just to protect the children from playing too much games by having game companies to implement facial recognition technologies that the parents can switch on in case they want their kids to have practically zero privacy. Now, a lot of that sounds really terrible, and I totally understand why there's a lot of panic on this matter, but there are many ways for people, including children, to cheat the system. You can actually buy adult accounts in the black market and even pay for services when you can bypass the time limit. You don't even have to buy. If the parents or any adult relatives or friends are feeling generous to them, they can even give them their accounts and have them to play their games on those accounts. And failing all of that, keep in mind that a lot of these protections only apply to video games that are being played online. So if you are playing single-player games that are completely offline and require no internet connection whatsoever, the government can't really do much to stop you. The reason is because the rules involve a real-time name registration system embedded before the download. These conditions are not possible for offline games, and since these restrictions only apply to offline games, this includes both the legit offline games and especially the not-so-legit offline games, ones that you acquire through the 7 Cs. China, in case you missed it, was incredibly notorious for having bootlegs and pirates pirating game softwares and even game hardwares left and right, so you can probably play these pirated games without the government snooping on you, unless if they're physically there. By the way, I said was. The thing is, piracy is not as rampant in China as before, and the reasons are actually pretty simple. The first one is due to the shift towards online gaming, which are a lot harder to pirate. It's not impossible, but most people don't know how to pirate those games, so they'd rather just pay some money to get that online games legitimately, or they don't have to pay at all for free-to-play games and only pay for microtransactions. And the second reason is because people get access to games easier, whether it be on their smartphone or on the PC. They don't have to go to shady websites to find hacked copies of games where they can just go to Steam or whatever digital distributions that they use and pay money to download the games there. It's easier and much more convenient. Unfortunately, most children who play video games play online video games. Unfortunately, most game companies, especially the ones in China, develop online video games. That's where a lot of video games these days are at its most profitable, and that's where a lot of game companies are investing. In fact, they can invest so much on them that they're gonna neglect single player altogether in favor of a completely online experience. That said, if you look at the gaming landscape, children aren't really the biggest spenders on video games, both in terms of money and in terms of time. Granted, ESA is taking US statistics, but from the US statistics alone, we know for a fact that gaming is mostly an adult hobby, and the ones who spend the most time and money in gaming are definitely adults. That is, unless if their parents are really neglectful and let their children to spend like thousands of dollars for in-game money or something, which has happened many times before, especially outside China. And thankfully, most parents, or at least in America, have taught children to ask them permission if they want to purchase any game-related things. So yeah, China's restrictions on gaming is getting more and more intense. Children are allowed to play games as much as they did last time, and the government will do whatever it takes to make sure that the social order is preserved. With that being said, there are still ways for people to cheat the system. Some of them free, some of them cost money. And while it might be the end of the world for online games, the same can't can't really be set towards offline games, as the government doesn't really have a lot of ways to restrict those. I feel like if this continues to happen, if the restriction towards online games are getting more and more apparent, especially towards children, I think China's gaming industry is gonna change its business models in favor of games that can be played offline, which is actually kind of hilarious if you think about it. All online games are gonna be stopped, and you know what? As somebody who doesn't play a lot of online games, I think that's for the better. But that wouldn't stop the government from applying something like always online DRM of some sort that will require all of your computers to be online so that they can... You know what? I'd rather not give them ideas.
Don't trust China. China is asshole.
I'd rather give you ideas to support this channel. Check out the links down below. You can support me through PayPal, Patreon, etc. And thanks for watching.